What next for the UK property market in 2022? This is part 2 of a 2-part series I've done on this subject. And in this video, I'm going to share with you my insights and what you need to do to prepare for 2022 in 7 key areas. Property prices, interest rates, what's happening with building material costs, residential rents, taxation for landlords, rules and regulations, and finally, to tie it all together, the strategies that you need to focus on in 2022. My name is Ranjan Bhattacharya. I'm a property investor and developer for the last 30 years. You may have seen me on the hit Sky TV show Property Elevator, or you may have attended one of our Central London property networking meets. Now, if you're new to this channel, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you're notified when we release new videos, which is pretty much 2 to 3 times a week. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is part 2, so make sure you see part 1 of my property market predictions for 2022. I released this video in September of 2021, so I was kind of way out there, if you like, in making some bold predictions for 2022. Now, in part 2, there's nothing to correct from that part 1 video. Everything still stands. All the information I'm going to give you now is new and supplementary to everything that I put out in part 1. So make sure you watch that too. We'll put a link up here and in the description below. So let's start with property prices. Now, I'm going to gloat a little bit here, folks. Now, the easiest way to get people to watch YouTube videos is to put some thumbnail up and about some impending disaster, crash, property prices are going to crash, it's called Armageddon and all that sort of stuff. Because that makes you guys watch things. You like the bad news. But as we were going into 2021, I was pretty much unique among commentators on the UK property market in saying that property prices would not crash. They would actually rise in 2021. And rise they did by a whopping 10%. We actually had double-digit growth during 2021. Now, of course, I discussed the reasons why in some detail in part 1 of this video. This is the inflationary effect, of course, of all the money printing that's gone on. It's also a little bit to do with the stamp duty holiday as well. But what about 2022? Has all this rapid price rises mean that it's all peaked? Is it going to fall over a cliff in 2022? Well, no, it ain't. And here's the reason why. Inflation is still on the way up. The Bank of England has said that they expect consumer inflation to hit about 5% in April, May next year. That's when it will peak a little bit, but it's still on its way up. So what does that mean for house prices if consumer inflation is on its way up? Well, what we tend to find that when interest rates are also low, there is a strong correlation between consumer price inflation and property prices. In other words, if consumer inflation is there, property prices will match it or exceed that rate of consumer inflation, provided interest rates are low. Now, we'll talk about interest rates in a moment, but for that reason alone, my prediction is that if the headline rate of inflation hits 5%, don't be surprised if UK house price average growth in 2022 exceeds that of the peak of the headline inflation rate during 2022. But you know what? People that keep predicting doom and gloom and crashes year after year are very much like some guy with a stopped clock. Because you know what? Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. You just have to wait enough time and eventually you'll be right. But that's not going to happen in 2022. Next up, there's interest rates. There's been a lot of talk that interest rates are going to go up, and people are often fearful of that. But I think this is largely talk. Yes, I believe interest rates will nudge up a little bit, but how much will they go up by? I would be exceptionally surprised if interest rates increased from the current 0.25% to even hit 1%. If they hit 1% in 2022, that would be extraordinarily high. Now, why do I say this? I've talked about this in previous videos as well. Government have very little option in terms of increasing interest rates. And that's because the proportion of government debt that we now have as a proportion to our GDP is close to 100%. Back in the old days, where governments used to influence monetary policy by changing interest rates, in those days, government debt was not even 50% of GDP. Now it's 100%. What does that mean? That means if the government put up interest rates, it will mean that the cost of servicing the huge government debt will balloon quite a lot. The way out of jail for the government is simply to let inflation do the job of inflating away the value of the government debt. And that's pretty much what I've been saying they would do, and it seems to me that that is what's transpiring. How am I predicting all this? Am I putting my finger in the air? Well, to a certain extent I am, but I'm looking at indicators. The indicator that I look at on interest rates is what's happening in the 5-year swap market. Movements on 5-year swap rates is a predictor of what your mortgage interest rates will be over the coming months. Now, what we've seen is that 5-year swap money has increased a little bit in the recent months, which does imply that the market has factored in a small rate rise, but nothing that dramatic. So I think there's a lot of talk about interest rate rises, mainly about setting mood music and setting the tone. In reality, the amount of room the government has for maneuver in terms of raising interest rates simply isn't there, as there has been in previous years, in previous cycles, and the instrument they're going to be using is letting a little bit of inflation kind of do the job for them. Fortunately, this strategy seems to be working, because the Bank of England has said that the inflation rate will peak at around 5% next year and start to come down from that point. I hope you're liking this video. If you are, smash that like button. Helps us out on YouTube. By the way, you know plenty of property people. Share this video with them. And if you're watching this, tell me what you think. Do you agree with what I'm saying so far? If you've got any questions on what's happening in 2022, put them in the comments. We'll be making some more videos to get you ready for 2022. So if you've got any questions of what's in store, put them in the comments. We'll address them in future videos. Now, building materials. The cost of building materials has gone up. Everything has gone up dramatically. Will the cost of materials continue to rise throughout 2022? Well, no. I think we are about to reach the peak of these rises that we've had. Now, as I said before, I'm not just picking these things out of thin air. I'm trying to find indicators that give me some evidence for making these sort of predictions. I mentioned before with interest rates, I look at swap rates, what's happening there. So what indicator can you use for building materials to make some kind of assessment? Well, one indicator I've been tracking are US lumber futures. Now, here's a graph showing the US lumber future market, and you can see that there's been meteoric rises in US lumber futures. But you see that's dramatically tailed off in recent weeks. What does that mean? That means the market is not expecting these continual rises in base materials to keep spiraling into 2022. So looking at this and other data, I think we'll start to see material price rises peak at about April 2022 and then start to come down. As I said in part 1 of this video, the way you need to mitigate the risk of these building material increases is to make sure you're doing good deals. What is a good deal? Well, when I look at deals, I'm only looking at stuff that has 30% margin, 40% return on cost. They're the key figures to look out for. And of course, if you're doing any building work right now, it's very, very important to get your building cost figures right. There's never been a better time to make sure you use a good quantity surveyor to help you in that estimation to get things right. Also, look at value engineering. Can costs be saved? I'll give you an example. You get a structural engineer in and they recommend some beams, steel beams, RSJ beams that are required on a particular project. Now, the structural engineer will typically over-specify these beams because they're worried about their indemnity insurance. And of course, if you over-specify things, then you are going to end up with much higher building costs. That's when the role of value engineering comes into play, to challenge what's been specified, to make sure it isn't over-engineered and you are actually building stuff which conforms to all regulations but isn't just kind of over-egging things. We'll get back to the video in just a moment. What is the most exciting opportunity in property right now, and that is repurposing defunct commercial buildings to residential use. Now, most people don't really know where to start, what to look for, and how to exploit these opportunities, and that's why I've prepared 90 minutes of free training for you to get you started on this wonderful journey. You can register for this free training at property-workshop.com. Join me on that free training, and I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the video. Now, on to residential rents. Now, we all know that in many areas, particularly London, rents were absolutely decimated during the COVID crisis. In many parts of London, residential rents fell by as much as 20%. Now, this has already pretty much recovered, but rents are actually increasing in London and in many other parts of the country. Now, this is partly due to inflation, but inflation alone doesn't account for all the increases in rents that we've had. As regular viewers to this channel will know, there's been a whole raft of government tax changes which have disproportionately affected small-time unincorporated landlords. And if you are an unincorporated landlord that just has one or two properties in your own name, you've held them for 6-7 years, you were never running it as a business. You were just running it as a bit of a part-time endeavor and possibly a pension or to supplement your income. Those sort of people are looking at selling up. And I think that trend has definitely accelerated, which has led to buy-to-let property being in short supply. Now, this is particularly an acute problem in higher value areas, because if you are new to buy-to-let in a higher value area, why would you do it? Because the yields are so poor. In higher value areas, often yields are as low as 3.5%. It doesn't make financial sense to do. So as people are leaving the market, the smaller landlords are leaving the market, there aren't enough new entrants coming in, particularly in higher value areas. Stay tuned to the end of this video and I'll share with you how you can actually achieve higher buy-to-let yields in high value areas. That's coming up later. If you're liking this video, of course, smash that like button, subscribe and all of that. But tell me what you think about what I'm saying in the comments below. Any questions you have about 2022, leave them there. I'll answer them in an upcoming video. Now, taxation that affects property investors and landlords. This is big news. I mean, many buy-to-let landlords were fearful of the dreaded capital gains tax review that Rishi Sunak announced. Many people were fearing that all these government giveaways, these eat out to help out that the Rishi Sunak has pissed money up the wall on and increased this government borrowing to such high levels. Well, all of that needed to be paid for, and many of us were fearful that it would be resting on landlords' shoulders to pay the burden for this by increased capital gains tax on disposals of rental properties. Now, I'm pleased to say we have some good news. The good news is that the whole CGT review has been put on ice. Now, what does that mean? They were proposing to bring down the annual capital gains tax allowance to £2,000 per person. That's been shelved. That's no longer going to happen. The other deadly thing they were going to do, which would have affected buy-to-let landlords up and down the country, is the equalisation of capital gains tax rates with income tax rates, which would have been deadly if you're selling a former buy-to-let property. That's all been scrapped. The other area that property people were fearing some changes to was pensions, and particularly how much contributions you can make into a SAS or a SIP, and also the lifetime allowance. There's been no changes there, so pensions are a phenomenally great vehicle for property investors, particularly when investing in commercial property. Now on to rules and regulations. Now, of course, in the last 10 years, every year goes by, there's some new rule or regulation that comes in that affects buy-to-let landlords. And with every new rule and regulation, there is a cost. There's a cost of complying to these regulations. And what that means is it brings your profitability down. When you look at yields on buy-to-let property, people think about gross yields. I mean, yields is basically the annual rent divided by the value of the property, expressed as a percentage. That gives you your yield. But that doesn't take into account your costs. Your net yield is exactly that. It's the annual rent minus your costs divided by the property value expressed as a percentage. What we have seen in recent years is as more and more regulations come in, there's a squeeze on those net yields, and this is going to continue. Now, some big changes which landlords will have to prepare for are the upcoming EPC regulations. Now, this isn't set to happen until 2025, and hopefully it won't happen because it's just going to be decimating for many, many people. But it's something that you need to think about in 2022, particularly with properties that you're looking at either buying or selling. You should take these things into account. By 2025, all rented property will need to achieve an EPC rating of C. Of course, if you're an owner-occupier, you can live in whatever property you like. But if you rent a property out, it will need to achieve an EPC rating of C. Many rental properties do not achieve this rating at the moment. And installing the sort of insulation and all this sort of stuff that you'll need to conform with the C rating may not be economically viable in many properties. For example, some properties will need thermal insulation upgrading. I mean, it's okay to put in a little bit of insulation in the loft and perhaps secondary glazing on the windows, but some of these buildings will actually need some form of insulation to the walls to make them comply. Now, if I've got a Victorian property and it's in Putney, then I've probably got the values, I've got the values, the house values high enough in order that the cost of adhering to these regulations is actually still worthwhile. The problem is going to be in low value areas. If you're in Liverpool or Blackpool or one of these other places where the property price is 50 grand, it's Victorian stock, then the cost of bringing that up to EPC grade C might not be economically viable. And you guys need to think about that. You guys need to think ahead in terms of what properties you may be thinking of disposing of in 2022 and what properties it is worth buying in low value areas. Now, I mentioned that thing about thermal insulation on the walls. A cheap way of doing that, and a method that a lot of people are doing, is to put the thermal insulation on the external brickwork of the building and then cover it with render, which changes the look of the property, but is less disruptive to the inside of the property to actually do and comply with. Now, this is great if you've got a butt ugly 1950s building somewhere, that's fine. But if you're in a conservation area, you ain't going to be allowed to do that. So that insulation has got to be on the inside, which means complete disruption and a complete refit of the whole property. That may simply not be economical to do in certain areas, so watch out for that. By 2025, expect the Section 21 to be abolished. Section 21 is, of course, the mechanism for getting your property back at the end of the tenancy. Section 21 allows you to get the property back without the tenant having been at any fault. You can simply get the property back because you want to, because it's yours. Expect that to be abolished by the time 2025 comes in. Now, one thing the government must do before that comes in is to invest in a better court system to give landlords the redress to get tenants out if they need to, if there's been some failure to comply. And I would like to think that's in place before Section 21 is abolished. But what this is going to mean for you is that you need to beef up your tenant referencing procedures. And I think this whole move to abolish Section 21 is just going to mean that landlords are going to favour A1 tenants. A1 tenants who have full-time employment, clean as a whistle, credit history and the like. Those guys will be able to rent property no problems at all. Everyone else will need a UK home-owning guarantor to basically back them and underwrite their tenancy agreement. And these are the measures you need to be putting in place in 2022 if you haven't already done so. Also, by 2025, as part of various reforms that are coming in, don't be surprised if you, as a landlord, if you're managing your tenancies yourself, you will have to be part of some sort of landlord redress scheme in the same way that letting agents are today. And that's all part of the government's move to professionalise the private rental sector and everyone that operates in it. So in readiness for all of this in 2022 as a private landlord, you need to be beefing up your professionalism and also beefing up your referencing procedures. Now, what do you reckon about all these regulations? Let me know in the comments below. And finally, let's look at trends and strategies for you to really profit in 2022. Now, quite frankly, if you're looking at building a property portfolio, in the old days, you would pretty much buy property, you'd have flats and houses dotted around all over the place, and that was called a portfolio. That sort of portfolio is going to be less and less profitable and less viable. And that's because the cost of regulatory compliance is going to squeeze your net yields and not make it as viable as it was before. The way to make buy-to-let portfolio investing work is to have a number of rental units under one rooftop. This isn't just me saying it, that's where all the institutional money is focused on. There's going to be a massive boom in the build-to-rent sector as institutional money, people like John Lewis, even banks like the Bank of Scotland, they're all coming in with build-to-rent schemes. What are build-to-rent schemes? It's about building many rental units of property, all in one complex under one rooftop, and letting them out on single lets. Why does that help? The concentration of properties under one rooftop means that your costs of regulatory compliance are slightly less because you've got economies of scale and it's all spread across multiple units under one in the same building. Now, one of the reasons why my training courses are so popular is that this is the area of property investing that I focus on. It's what I call the CMO, the commercial building in multiple occupation. It is about how smaller landlords can move away from having buy-to-let properties all over the place and having a concentration of properties under one rooftop, therefore benefiting from these economies of scale and greater profitability. The best way to do that right now is by picking up former commercial buildings which are defunct and in plentiful supply, and using the new permitted development rules introduced on the 1st of August 2021 to convert them into residential use, which you can do so under a very light touch planning regime, which literally takes you 56 days to get your permission. So it's very quick indeed. So if you take a former shop or an office building or something like that and convert it into, say, 4 or 5 one-bedroom flats, what you end up with is a concentration of rental units under one rooftop and higher yields. Now, I mentioned earlier on in this video how in higher value areas, many smaller landlords are exiting the market and there's a massive shortage of supply. And that shortage of supply is partly due to the fact that it's not worthwhile for new entrants to enter the market. Now take a look at this 2-bedroom flat on sale in Rickmansworth, Hertfordshire. The price of this flat is £450,000. The rent on it would be about £1,300 a month. So if you're a buy-to-let investor looking at buying that flat, you're looking at a yield of not even 3.5%. That's gross yield, by the way. Your net yield will be far less than that when you take into account the service charges that would be payable on a flat in a building like that. Now take a look at this building, which is bang opposite the one I just showed you. It's a simple shop and uppers. Purchased for £500,000, just 50 grand more than the flat opposite. Using the new permitted development rules, you can create 2 2-bedroom flats in the space above and you have a shop below. This is what we call a commercial building in multiple occupation. What I mean by that is it's a building that can have a mixture of residential units and commercial units all under one rooftop. the yield from this building will be 9.5%. And the net yield won't be much short of that because you have the whole freehold, there are no things like service charges to pay to another freeholder. Now, this is what the smart money will be doing in property in 2022. Now, if you want to find out more about doing buy-to-let in a smart way in 2022, you really want to be attending some of my free masterclasses. I'll put some links to when we're doing the next ones in the description below. But I also run an 8-week commercial property academy course, which will really get you up to speed to make 2022 your best year ever in property. I'll leave a link for that as well. Check that out, because if you have the right knowledge, you can make buy-to-let and property investing work in any area. That's it for this video. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon to see more content from us each and every week, and see you guys in the next video. High streets across the land are changing forever. Basically, there's an oversupply of retail premises. Shops are closing down, more are going to close down in the future. The government know this, and that's why they're introducing a light touch planning system which allows small developers to easily repurpose these buildings to residential use under a light touch planning regime called permitted development. Now, this is going to be the biggest revolution and the biggest change and the biggest opportunity for property investors that I've ever seen. And this is all coming into effect on 1st of August. So you need to know what's happening and what properties to look for to take advantage of these opportunities so that you can get in there and take that first mover advantage. I've got a 90-minute free masterclass to get you ready for August the 1st. Make sure you join me. Click the link below. Whether you're a beginner or expert, we'll get you started.